are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Rick McKenna, but today's case is a survived story. This is the kidnapping of 15-year-old Mary Vincent. Now, this survival story is not one you can possibly prepare yourself for. The strength that this human had to muster in order to live is unfathomable. The most beautiful thing of all is she didn't fight for herself. She fought for every other possible victim that her attacker could encounter. She saved her life to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. In my eyes, this woman is more than a hero. She's an angel on earth. By the way, I post so much content like this. It's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1978 in Nevada, and the Vincent family lived in Las Vegas. Now at the time, they had a 15-year-old daughter named Mary who absolutely loved to dance. That's something that she did so often, and in dance classes, instructors would actually tell her that she was basically born for greatness when it came to dance, and that she would probably go on to be a leader in some sort of dance group, whether that was in Las Vegas or Hawaii or Australia, but she was going to make it big. And she was really excited about this. She was also really good with her hands when it came to art, but her ultimate dream in life was to become a mother. Now, although she was doing well personally, her family was not, and her parents, who were Herb and Lucy, were having a bit of trouble, and they actually were deciding to divorce. Now, this was really rough on Mary, as it is for most teenagers that, thought that their family was going to be ripped apart and everything they knew was going to change. Her father, Herb, was a slot machine repairman, and her mother, Lucy, was a casino card dealer, and they had 7 children together. And she was so used to this dynamic that she just couldn't fathom it being any different. And so her behaviors really started to kind of show the mindset she was in at this time, and that she just didn't know how to handle it being only 15. So she began to skip school as well. Now, one day while she was at home, her sister actually came to tell her that her father was coming, that he had a migraine, and that he was mad at her. Now, take this as you will, but this was a warning from her sister to her, and she decided she needed to get out immediately. Now, I'm not sure what her father was mad at her about, but she decided that she was going to run away. Now, at first, this was with her boyfriend, and they decided to go together. They were living in California and in a car. But like most teenage relationships, this didn't last, and so Mary was soon on her own, and she had to figure out where to go next. Thankfully, her uncle did live in California and allowed her to stay there for quite a while. But as the summer ended, she decided that she was done being technically alone, and she wanted to go home. And the first step to doing this was to go to her grandfather's house. So he lived in the town of Corona, and she just needed to find a way there. She was ready to head out. However, she didn't know that this journey would change her life forever. She stood on the side of the highway in Berkeley, and this was on September 29th. She was with a whole bunch of different teens who were all holding signs saying where they were headed, and this was so completely normal. They didn't have Uber. They didn't have Lyft. They didn't have an easy way to get a ride. So they hitchhiked. And it was completely normal to get in a car with strangers. They weren't as worried about a possible serial killer sitting in the driver's seat because they had to get to their destination. However, Mary wouldn't make it to her grandfather's house in the way that she expected, because before anyone could realize that she was missing, she would be found 2 days from when she was seen on the side of the road trying to get a ride, and she was seen at that point in the middle of the road. Now, this couple had drove up because they had actually missed their exit somehow. They were on vacation, they had missed this exit, and they decided to drive down this road to try to get on the right path. And they somehow made it to this area. It seemed like it was a miracle that they had done so, because they immediately saw her, wrapped her in a blanket, threw her in the car, and raced to the nearest phone. Now, by this point, Mary was completely in the nude, with her arms in the air, close to passing out. The only thing Mary had said to them was, "He raped me." Once they sped to the payphone and called the police, they waited there with Mary until the police got there, and that's when Life Flight also arrived to take her to the hospital. They found that Mary was in such a horrific state. The reason she was holding her arms up in the air wasn't just to get their attention, but to stop the blood from draining out, because her arms had been cut off below the elbow. Now, she was drifting in and out of consciousness, but she was hanging on to life, and many didn't know whether she would make it or not. Doctors found that she had lost half the blood in her body and was in shock, and she also had broken ribs. They weren't sure that she could fight through all of this, but they didn't know how much she had already had to fight through. She was a fighter. And so 10 days later, Mary was actually stable once again. And that's when police would come to talk to her about what exactly happened. Now, they needed to find out who had done this. And by this point, she was actually also being fitted for prosthetics on both of her arms in order to be able to, learn how to function once again. And Mary was also able to give a description of the man who had done this to her to the police that was so detailed that it would not take long at all for a match to be found. But investigators also had to ask Mary what no trauma survivor wants to do, what's not easy for anyone to do, and that was to tell her story. So she relived what happened to her moment by moment in order to tell them everything. She began by saying that she was trying to hitchhike to her grandfather's house that day, and that she was with a whole bunch of different teenagers, so she felt pretty comfortable. They were all going in the same direction, and she really wanted to get home by this point. She was sick and tired of being alone, and she said that there was a man who then drove up in a blue van, and he was kind of old, like the age of her grandfather, so she didn't really think much of it, and he kind of looked at all of them and then told Mary that he could take her, but he refused taking anybody else. Now, the teens began to speak up to Mary, saying she probably shouldn't go with him because they were all going in the same direction. There was no reason that he could not take them all in this huge van if he could take her. And that they basically didn't want her to be going alone with him. But Mary was so tired and so lonely and just wanted to get home that all of that just kind of slipped her mind. And she got in the car. This innocent girl knew this way of traveling as a normal thing to do. Stranger danger wasn't a thing, and kids weren't taught that humans should be feared because some of them were monsters. This man was nothing more to her than a way back to a life she so desperately missed. Everything seemed normal too, at least for a little while, but unfortunately, it always does at first. This man appeared to be wearing a uniform that was like from a mechanic, like he worked as a mechanic, but he was also a bit heavier in weight, and he would tell Mary that he actually had a daughter her age. This would make anyone feel a bit more comfortable, knowing that, oh, he's a dad. He could be my father. He knows that. So Mary started to, calm down the little nerves that she did have around him. But sadly, this man didn't look at her like his daughter. Or maybe he did, and then that man should have never been around a daughter. But the strange behavior really started to occur when Mary would sneeze. And this man would kind of place his hand on the back of her neck and kind of force her closer to him. And basically say, let's see if you're sick. Now, Mary was creeped out by this point, pulled away, and started sitting closer to the side door, trying to get away from him because she just felt really odd. But, you know, she couldn't really jump out when they were going down a highway. That is when this man would tell her that he actually wasn't going south, which was where she needed to go. He was going north. However, he said that he would stop and drop her off at Interstate 5 Junction, which was like kind of in the middle. And so Mary agreed that this was fine, and they continued driving. It was going to be a little while until they got there, and she was so exhausted that she actually ended up falling asleep. Now, when she woke up, it was actually dark outside, but she could still see the signs on the highway. She noticed right away that they were far past that Interstate 5 junction, and she was now headed in the same direction that he said he was going in. Mary began to feel around for anything she could use as a weapon, and underneath the seat she did find like a large pointy object, and she began to point it at this man, threatening him, saying, "You better turn around or I will hurt you." And this man actually did what he was told. He turned around on the highway and he told Mary he was an honest man who made an honest mistake and he wasn't going to hurt her. Now, I'm sure at this point, Mary wanted to believe him. She might have even believed him. But even now, as they were headed in the right direction, this wouldn't be the end of the horrors. See, by this point, it was dark, and they were driving a little bit farther when this man said that he needed to go to the bathroom, and he pulled off onto an isolated road. Now, this was secluded, and he told Mary that he was going to get out and go to the bathroom real quick, and that he basically didn't know how long was going to be the next rest stop, and he couldn't wait. He'd been drinking lots of alcohol prior to this too, which caused him to need to go to the bathroom. So Mary thought, it all added up, that she would just let him go. But she also began to get really nervous being in the middle of nowhere, and so she decided at this point she was going to take a run for it. No matter how far she had to run, no matter how close the nearest house was. So when he stopped and got out of the vehicle, Mary also hopped out. Now, at this point, he was not looking. He was doing his own business, and Mary was just about to run when she noticed that her shoe was untied, and she actually bent down to tie it up real quick before she could go. A way that was almost like a movie. She would be hit over the head as she bent down and would be knocked out. Everything went black. When she came to once again, she was in the back of the van that she had been riding in, but now she was tied up, and her hands were tied above her head. Her feet were also tied, and she would be sexually assaulted multiple times. I asked him why he was doing this, and he never responded. And when he fell asleep afterwards, Mary tried her best to get out of it, to get out of the ties on her wrist, to get out of that van and away from him, but she couldn't, no matter how hard she tried. Mary wanted to die in this moment, asking God to kill her, and that she couldn't handle it. And that's when this man would wake up, and he would move the van to a different location, concealed again by the night sky, and she would be taken further into the middle of nowhere. This is when her ties were cut, and this man told her to do everything that he told her to do, or he would kill her. So she did. She drank the alcohol he forced her to drink, and when he sexually assaulted her over and over again, she said nothing. This time, though, she would pass out, and she did so as she watched the sun rise. When she woke up, she realized that her bad dreams were not simply nightmares, but reality. And this man then demanded that she lay on the outside of the van in the street with her legs still tied. Mary then began to plead with him to free her, that she wouldn't tell anybody, but this man instead reached for an object that was in his van and pulled it over to Mary. Now, with everything happening so quickly, all Mary could do was grasp at his arms to try to get him to stop whatever he was going to do, and that is when she started falling backwards. But she hadn't ever released her grip, and she was so very confused. When Mary looked up, she saw her own hand and arm dangling from his shirt, from where she gripped his arm, and she was no longer attached to it. Mary was kicking and screaming, trying to get away from this man, and he was screaming that if she wanted to be set free, he would set her free. And that's when he went after her other arm, which took a lot longer since she was fighting back and knew what he was doing at this point. The man then started flailing and screaming himself, and Mary realized this is because he had seen that her arm was still attached to him. That is when Mary decided to stay still and to play dead, because that's how she believed she was going to survive, the only way she was going to survive. So this actually seemed to work. The man started dragging her quite a ways on the ground and then suddenly lifted her up and threw her. And the last thing Mary heard as she fell was him telling her she was free. Now this is where her ribs broke, and this wasn't the end either, because the man climbed down after her and drug her further into a darker area, then finally left her. Mary was lying there on the ground, bleeding, cold and afraid, feeling everything going on in her body. Every little thing. But she was too tired to do anything about it. She didn't think she could do anything. She was telling herself not to go to sleep because she knew what that meant, but she was finding it harder and harder to do so. And finally, when she was about to succumb and just let herself drift off, this isn't when Mary would actually fall asleep, like most people believed that she would. And this is what's so incredible listening to her story, because Mary would say she heard a voice. She didn't know if it was hers, but she heard it loud and clear. And it said, "Don't go to sleep. You have to live. If you don't, he's going to do this to someone else. You can't let that happen." Hearing that, I just got chills. Hearing that, Mary refused to die. At that point, she was going to save the possible victims of this man if she had to fight for her life to do so. So no matter what she had to do, she kind of forced herself to snap back out of it, or back into it, I guess. And she began looking around at her surroundings, and she realized that she was in about a 30-foot drop of a ravine. And she would need to climb out of it. The only problem was she didn't have hands to do so. So at this point, Mary dug what was left of her arms into the dirt, packing it with mud, hoping that would stop the bleeding. And she scaled the side of that ravine with what was left of those arms. She had to use her own open wounds to save herself. And there was no sign of her attacker anywhere. She was listening this whole time. And so thankfully she realized that she was gonna get out if she could just climb, but she didn't know how far it would be until she found somebody, and she didn't know if she could make it. That's when she started hearing cars kind of zooming past like they were on a highway, and so she kind of had that hope once again, and she continued climbing and climbing, and it took her hours, and it was nighttime once again by the time she got to the top. She held her arms above her head to try to slow the bleeding, and she started walking 3 miles to the nearest highway. She was naked, she was bleeding, but she finally got there. And that is when she saw a car. It was a red convertible, and these boys sped up and saw her, so they slowed down. But when they got a closer look, they sped away because they were so scared of how she looked. And at this point, Mary thought that was it. There was no hope for her. But out of nowhere, a sweet couple who had missed their exit came out of nowhere to help her. And they saved her life. But Mary had saved her life too. She was her own hero. Now, even her family didn't know how to react when she was found, hearing what she had gone through, because they didn't even know she was missing at this point. While they were searching for her attacker, Mary was working on how to use her new arms, and she was getting so angry and frustrated and was just devastated with her new life, and she just wanted things to go back to normal. But thankfully she did have a wonderful nurse who was willing to help her and continue pushing her to live in a new way, because a new way didn't mean that it wasn't worth living. Mary told this nurse all the time, this man destroyed everything about me. My way of thinking, my life, the way I held on to innocence. That is when Mary would get the news that her attacker had been caught and arrested. He was a man from San Pablo, California, and his neighbor had actually turned him in after seeing the very sketch that Mary had provided. Not only had she saved herself, she had caught her killer, or caught her attempted killer. But I think that what he did to her was just as horrific. His name was Larry Singleton. He was 50 years old. He was an ex-merchant mariner who had traveled the world and been divorced twice. He had also been arrested at one point for contributing to the delinquency of a minor, or basically an adult that allows a child to be involved in illegal behavior. He was also known to be a violent drunk who actually did have a daughter Mary's age named Deborah. But Deborah was terrified of her own father and wanted nothing to do with him. While Larry was being investigated, clues were found pretty quickly to connect him to Mary's crime because Mary's cigarette butts and bits of her clothing were found on his property. The clothing was actually in a fire where he tried to destroy this evidence. Now, his home, he had a home in California where that was found, but his home in Nevada was also searched, and that is where a blue van was found, which is exactly the car she said she got into. Now, all of the interior in this van had been taken out, washed. This was actually done with the help of a neighbor who came forward saying that he helped him do so. This neighbor said he had no idea why he was cleaning, but Larry asked him to help, and so he helped this old man, not thinking much of it. It was also found that a few days after Mary was left there to die, Larry took a bunch of sleeping pills and attempted to take his own life. Yet, when he was brought in, he was quick to deny everything that involved the crime, saying that Mary may have been in his van, but that she was a $10 a night whore. He said he actually picked up 3 people that day. It was Mary and 2 men named Pedro and Larry. And yes, another Larry besides him. And he said they decided to have fun together. They smoked at a bar on their way, and afterwards they all paid Mary for sex. But Larry said that the problem was he fell asleep afterwards, and when he woke up, the other Larry was driving, and Mary was no longer there. He said her clothes were, but this other Larry told him that she had been sent to California, apparently without clothing and without saying goodbye. Now, Larry Singleton was blaming this other Larry, and it almost made me wonder if this had some sort of connection to him having a personality disorder. Now, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, can also be called multiple personality disorder, is said to be caused by trauma that forces someone to assume this new identity to basically avoid bad memories that they have gone through. Now, I want to say that there is quite a stigma around, multiple personality disorder. There's a bad stigma that these individuals are scary and harmful, and that's not what I'm here to spread whatsoever. But I think just like any human, there are good people and there are bad people. So just like any person with this mental illness, there are good and there are bad. So we were talking about a possible bad person that has this mental illness. But the only reason I bring it up is because this could be why he suddenly said there was 2 different Larrys. I mean, really, if you're going to come up with a story, you can't come up with another name besides your own. That just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, perhaps Pedro was another one of his identities. We don't know. It could be placing all of the trauma of what he did to Mary on these 2 other identities. So Larry Singleton was, in his mind, innocent. So he didn't have to deal with it, and it's also said to cause, DID is said to cause gaps in the memory, where you have no idea what has happened because the other identities are in charge. Perhaps this is why Larry said that he fell asleep in the van, and when he woke up, the other Larry was driving. Because the other Larry was driving when he woke up or changed identities to be in the driver's seat. I'm not 100% sure how that all works, so feel free to correct me if I have anything mistaken below if you know more, but unless it was just an outright lie and he just made up the entire thing for no reason, that could explain a little bit. Because Larry did go on to say that Mary had actually tried to kidnap him and said that she would accuse him of rape if he didn't drive her to LA. So he just continued to throw out different stories. But Larry would actually be brought to trial 6 months later. And I don't believe that he or his attorney tried to plead insanity. So I'm not sure, if DID was present or if they found anything at all, but Mary would actually be in that very courtroom to tell her story, right in front of her attacker, which has to be horrifying to do, and he would actually be sentenced to 14 years for rape, attempted murder, and sex offenses. Hearing this, you're probably angry. Unfortunately, that is all that could be given in California at the time, and even the judge said, if I had the power, I would send him to prison for the rest of his natural life. But there was nothing anyone could do. That was the maximum sentence. Now, everyone left the courtroom that day with mixed feelings because the attacker had been caught and sentenced. But it was practically nothing compared to how much Mary had gone through and would have to continue to go through with the way she now lived her life. But the worst part of all is as Mary was leaving the courtroom that day, she just somehow happened to pass Larry. And that is when he would whisper to her, I'll finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life. This is a statement that would haunt her for years to come. Now, Mary would actually win $2 million in a civil case against him. However, he had no money, so she couldn't be paid. I think it's easy to forget that Mary at this point was still a 15-year-old teenager going through all of this. I just kept thinking there's no way such a little young thing could have had to go through this, but she is only 15. She was. So she had to go home, had to continue school, and of course this would now be a school for the disabled, and this is where the nightmares also began. She was screaming every night, reliving what happened to her over and over again, and even though Mary went to a psychologist for help, she still felt like a freak. That's what she called herself. She couldn't do the things that she used to love the most, and especially dance, because although she still had her legs, muscle had actually been taken from them to save one of her arms, and so they were extremely weak. And you have to have strong muscles for dance, and so she really couldn't do that any longer. Now, she also couldn't be around the same people because everybody looked at her differently, and everyone knew who she was, because it's not like everyone thought, that girl looks like Mary Vincent who survived. Her arms gave it away every time. The rest of her teenage years were filled with anger and fighting the memories that haunted her and fearing the world. And her parents eventually did divorce, and she graduated high school. And that's when she found something that she was so passionate about, because she wanted to talk to other teenagers about hitchhiking and the dangers and what can happen to you, because most didn't think anything could, just like Mary didn't. This was really beneficial for them, as well as Mary telling her story, but she was actually verbally attacked by one of the students listening, who was a male, and she decided to stop altogether to, keep her mental health at a good point and not put herself through that when she didn't have to. She would actually have a son while living in a town in California where nobody knew who she was. 2 years later, she actually had another son, and it was now 1988. And she was living a happy life. But Larry actually appealed his conviction. Now, at this appeal, it was claimed that a psychologist's report of Larry being mentally disabled as a sex offender was not shown at trial. And it was also said that when Larry cut Mary's arms off, he wasn't attempting to kill her. That was denied. The appeal was denied, but 8 years and 4 months into his sentence, he was released. Not even the full 14 years. For good behavior. And this is even after a psychologist who looked after him said, because he is so out of touch with his hostility and anger, he remains an elevated threat to others' safety inside and outside prison. Larry would then charge Mary for kidnapping. Protests broke out in California at this time, hearing that Larry was being released. They basically said they didn't want him in the area. So everywhere that the government tried to move Larry, he was denied by the public. In fact, this caused him to be kept in a trailer on the grounds of the prison until his parole was up because nobody wanted him. This is also why the Singleton Bill was created, which ceases early release of criminals who have tortured victims and the ability to give those criminals 25 to life. If Larry had been given this sentence, a victim would have been saved. And no, I'm not just talking about Mary, but we'll get there in a little bit. Meanwhile, hearing about this, Mary was horrified. The man that she feared the most was now out in the public, roaming. She actually went into hiding in a small town with her sons because the man who traumatized her was free. Larry was allowed to move to Florida a year later, but only a year after that, he actually was stealing things. He was given a 60-day sentence for that. And he said he was just simply a confused old man. 7 years later, it was now February 19th, 1997. And this is when things would become even more horrific. Because a local house painter would be outside when he started hearing noises. This was coming from a different house, like the neighbor's house, and someone sounded like they were calling for help. So he went over to see what was wrong, to see if he could help. And that is when he saw a naked man choking a naked woman in his living room. The 911 caller allegedly told the operator that he could hear bones being crunched. When the officer arrived, he knocked on the door only to have it opened and come face to face with this naked man who was covered in blood. And he said that he was cutting vegetables, and that's what happened. And then the phone rang. And this man went to go answer it, and the officer peeked in and saw the bloody, naked woman on the couch. She was sitting there motionless. Now, a month prior to this same man was actually saved by a neighbor who had found him trying to inhale car exhaust in his driveway, trying to take his life. But this neighbor saved him, and he was taken to a psychiatric ward where he was kept there for a week before he checked himself out. Only a few weeks later, he would be with a dead body in his own home. The woman's name was Roxanne Hayes. She was a mother who had 3 children who made money any way she could, and that included being a sex worker. She was 31 years old, and now her children didn't have a mother because the man who owned the home she was in had stabbed her multiple times with a butcher knife. This was none other than Larry Singleton. He had been released and he had done it again, but this time, unfortunately, the woman did not survive. His prior victim, Mary, the one who he had told he would come back for, she was now instantly put back into reliving her trauma as he was brought into custody for murder, because she knew how close she was to being his murder victim as well. Mary's nightmares came back, and they would start with her attack, but this time they would end in her watching worse things happen to other people, because that was the whole point of her saving her own life, was to stop him from hurting others. And she wasn't able to do that with Roxanne because the justice system failed her. She couldn't stop thinking about Roxanne. Anytime anyone would say Larry's name or show his picture, she would go into a panic. In fact, she started hiring bodyguards and she was moving different places, and once she even lived in an abandoned gas station. Meanwhile, Larry was telling investigators that he had met Roxanne at a local supermarket and agreed to pay her $20 to come home with him. Larry said when they got to his house she wanted more money and tried to take it from his wallet, which is why they started fighting. Larry said that somehow she got a knife in her hand and that he took it from her. And as he was trying to get it, he stabbed her multiple times. Thankfully, investigators didn't believe any of this story, and Mary was then asked to testify at his trial. This was going to be an extremely hard thing for her to do. But once again, she did it. She would do it for Roxanne. She would do it for every other victim that could possibly come in contact with this monster if she didn't. Larry was still saying that he, never meant to kill Roxanne, that it was due to too much emotion, that he was just a confused old man Mary went into detail about exactly what he did to her and how he knew what he was doing. Mary said, "I wanted to see his eyes. Eyes are important. When he was on top of me, I looked at the axe, trying to stay alive. I asked later if I could look him in the eye, but it didn't happen." Now, Mary only ever referred to him as her attacker, not wanting to give him the power of his own name. 4 hours of deliberation later, Larry Singleton was sentenced to death. For Mary, this meant that her monster was off the streets. But there was another woman whose monster was locked up now too. And that was Larry's own daughter, Deborah, the one that he had told Mary about on the ride together. Deborah knew her father's evil behavior. She'd grown up with it. She had dealt with it for many years, with his, violent attacks and anger issues. And in fact, when he was in prison the first time for Mary's attack, she wrote him saying she wanted no relationship with him, and that she changed her name and moved away. That's how serious it was to her. These 2 girls could finally breathe, but they shouldn't have had to been holding their breath, hoping that a monster didn't strike. That monster should have been taken care of. Mary would start drawing after this and using her new hands in a way she never thought she could. She creates her own version of female action figures. She wants to show strong, independent women, but I think that the most important one of all to acknowledge here is Mary herself. And I don't say that to be cheesy. I say that as the truth. That is exactly who Mary is. The most amazing superhero I've ever heard of, because she didn't have magical powers. She didn't have training. She did it because she wanted to save other people. She did it out of the goodness of her heart. Her sons were teenagers by this point, and they also had a ton of animals, and she had met a man that she believed was Mr. Right. She says that she really never let herself indulge in the anger and the hate after the incident, and that she wouldn't be here today if she had. 3 years after Larry was sentenced, he actually died of cancer in prison at the age of 74. Mary wasn't relieved though. She actually wanted to know what was in that dark soul of his and felt robbed of the opportunity to get to know that. But when she saw the look of relief on her sons' faces, who had gone through, all these years of being scared too, she felt that that was enough closure. That's what she needed. That's all she needed. But something that's very important to Mary in teaching others is, it doesn't matter what you think. You're not 10 feet tall and bulletproof. I used to think that, but look what happened to me. Because there's always somebody who can take you down if you don't stay aware. And that's the whole reason I like to tell some of these stories, that if it's not for the victims and telling their story, it's from making you guys aware. And I think it's wonderful that Mary wants to spread that message as well. And I just truly have never, ever heard of a more incredible person. I'm so happy that you guys like this series of Survived. If you don't know if this is the first time you're coming across, I have a whole series of survival stories. I'll link down below the playlist, because I truly do think that sharing people's stories is just as important, even if, they did make it, because they did still go through so much. And I think it just is a little bit of light in such a dark topic. So yeah, I hope you guys got inspiration out of this, and I hope that if Mary is watching, she knows just how much I look up to her, and I hope people all around the world after hearing her story feel the same. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.